Every global reserve currency in history has died. Not some of them, every single one. The Portuguese real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, all gone. Each one believed they were different. Each one believed their currency would last forever. Each one was wrong. This is not a prediction. This is a pattern. The US dollar entered this same pattern in 1944. Right now, it is in stage 5. Let me walk you through this pattern. The 7 phases every reserve currency experiences and precisely where the dollar stands today, but first, you need to grasp what a reserve currency actually means. It's not simply a powerful currency. It's the currency other countries store in their central bank vaults, the currency used to price commodities worldwide. The currency international trade gets measured in. When you hold reserve status, every nation on earth needs your money to purchase oil. They need your currency. To balance trade accounts, they need your currency to park safe assets. They need your bonds. This creates what economists call exorbitant privilege. You print money and ship it overseas to buy actual goods. Other nations must manufacture products to earn your currency. You run unlimited trade deficits because foreign countries must stockpile your currency for reserves. You borrow at cheaper rates because worldwide demand for your bonds is built into the system, not optional. Holding reserve currency status is the supreme economic advantage. It's why empires battle to get it and why they crumble when they lose it. Every reserve currency starts identically with crushing military strength that controls vital trade pathways, not just possessing a mighty military, but controlling the channels where global commerce flows. In the 1450s, Portugal accomplished something nobody had done before. They mastered ocean navigation. While other European kingdoms still sailed along coastlines, Portuguese sailors crossed open seas. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, opening a water route to Asia that avoided Ottoman-controlled land paths. Then they weaponized this edge. Portuguese warships ruled the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, and Atlantic. They built armed trading posts at key bottlenecks: Goa, Malacca, Macau, Mozambique. These weren't simple ports. They were military fortresses where Portuguese cannons decided who could trade and under what terms. Want spices from the Moluccas? Deal with Portugal. Want to trade with India? Get Portuguese approval first. They collected fees, imposed taxes, and captured ships that tried sneaking past their network. This military stranglehold over trade routes made the Portuguese real. The currency that counted. Traders across Europe, Africa, and Asia needed reals to do business in Portuguese-controlled waters. It became the money of international commerce, not because gold backed it or economic theory supported it, because cannons backed it. The Dutch followed this exact blueprint in the 1600s. The Dutch East India Company wasn't merely a trading business, it was a military force. It commanded its own army and fleet at peak strength. The VOC operated 40 warships and employed 20,000 troops. They captured Portuguese outposts, grabbed control of the Spice Islands, and established Amsterdam as the hub of worldwide trade. Dutch vessels dominated the Baltic, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean. To conduct trade, you needed guilders, the currency of whoever controlled the seas. Britain perfected this approach in the 1800s at maximum power. The Royal Navy operated more warships than the next 5 countries together. Britannia rules. The waves wasn't poetry, it was reality. The British held the Suez Canal, Gibraltar, Singapore, the Straits of Malacca. Every crucial bottleneck for global trade sat under British control. The pound sterling became the planet's currency because British naval strength made international trade impossible without it. The United States reached this same position after World War II, not simply by fielding a powerful military, but by controlling worldwide trade infrastructure. The U.S. Navy rules every ocean, 11 aircraft carrier battle groups more than all other nations combined. America controls or maintains bases near every critical trade choke point: Hormuz, Malacca, Suez, Panama, Bab el-Mandeb. This isn't about protecting America. It's about controlling global commerce, making international trade unable to function without American blessing. That's Stage 1 military supremacy over trade routes. The dollar secured this in 1945 and holds it now. Check. Once you control trade pathways, you start gathering wealth from everywhere else, not through robbery, through favorable exchange. Portugal in the 1500s ran enormous trade surpluses. They purchased spices, silk, and porcelain from Asia, using gold and silver, but they sold European products, textiles, weapons, African slaves at massive markups. The trade balance tilted toward Lisbon. Portuguese ships came back loaded with Asian merchandise that sold for 10 times what they paid. This surplus transformed Lisbon into one of Europe's richest cities. The Portuguese crown's trade revenues grew so large they funded the entire government without heavily taxing citizens at home. The Dutch in the 1600s executed this even more systematically. Amsterdam became the planet's warehouse. Merchandise from Asia, the Americas, and Africa all flowed through Amsterdam. The Dutch bought cheap in one market, sold expensive in another, and pocketed the difference. They weren't just traders, they were arbitrageurs on a planetary scale. The Dutch trade surplus was so massive that Amsterdam overflowed with wealth, canals lined with grand homes, city merchants richer than many European monarchs. Britain in the 1800s ran the biggest trade surplus in history up to that moment. They shipped manufactured products, textiles, steel, machinery, ships to the world. They brought in raw materials, cotton, tea, rubber at prices. British buyers set. London dictated the terms of trade. The surplus built Britain into Earth's wealthiest nation. London's financial center handled more capital than the rest of Europe together. The United States experienced the most dramatic trade surplus in history, from 1945 to 1970. After World War II, America stood as the only major industrial power with undamaged infrastructure. Europe and Asia were rebuilding. The U.S. shipped machinery, cars, steel, and consumer products to the world. The trade surplus was so enormous that dollars poured into foreign central banks faster than they could recycle them. U.S. gold reserves swelled. Fort Knox held over 20,000 tons of gold by the 1950s, more than all other countries combined. This is Stage 2, massive trade surpluses gathering global wealth through advantageous exchange. The dollar achieved this from 1945 to 1970, but here's where the pattern starts shifting. Stage 2 never lasts forever. Eventually, the reserve currency nation moves from making goods to buying them, from exporting to importing, from running surpluses to running deficits. That's when Stage 3 kicks in. At some moment, the world formalizes what's already happening. They officially make your currency the reserve. This is the summit, the instant of maximum power. For Portugal, this occurred in the early 1500s. European kingdoms and Asian traders officially acknowledged the real as the main currency for international deals. Treaties got written, pricing trade in reals. It became the benchmark. For the Dutch, it happened in the mid-1600s. The guilder became the currency of preference for international contracts. Bills of exchange got written in guilders. Even the British East India Company used guilders for some deals because Amsterdam's financial markets offered the most liquidity worldwide. For Britain, it happened at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 after Napoleon's defeat. The pound sterling gained explicit recognition as the global benchmark. International treaties, loans, and trade contracts got priced in pounds. The gold standard most nations adopted was effectively a pound standard because Britain controlled the regulations. For the United States, it happened at Bretton Woods in 1944. 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire and formally agreed to make the dollar the world's reserve currency. Other currencies would peg to the dollar would peg to gold at $35 per ounce. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank were created to manage this arrangement. It was history's most explicit formalization of reserve status. But here's what nobody mentions about Stage 3. This is the peak. This is as excellent as it gets. Because formalizing reserve status plants the seeds of its own death. Once you're the reserve currency, the world needs your currency more than your products, so you quit making goods. You start importing the trade surplus flips into a deficit. and that deficit becomes permanent. This is called the Triffin dilemma, named after economist Robert Triffin, who explained it in 1960. For the world to possess enough dollars to use as reserves and for trade, the U.S. must run trade deficits. The U.S. must send dollars overseas, but running endless deficits weakens the currency's value. You can't simultaneously be the world's reserve currency and keep a strong trade balance. It's mathematically impossible. So every reserve currency, once it hits stage 3, begins sliding toward stage 4. This is where the pattern becomes unstoppable. The reserve currency nation quits producing wealth and starts consuming it. Portugal witnessed this in the mid-1500s. The trade surplus vanished. Instead of shipping goods out, Portugal was bringing everything in: grain from Sicily, textiles from Flanders, manufactured products from across Europe. They paid for this with gold and silver from Brazil and Africa, but they weren't creating wealth. They were spending wealth piled up earlier. The Portuguese crown's expenses exploded. King John III spent lavishly on palaces, churches, and the royal court. Military costs to maintain the empire drained resources. And here's the critical part: they didn't notice the danger because money kept flowing. As long as Brazilian gold kept arriving, they could keep spending, but the gold wasn't unlimited, and they weren't building anything productive with it. They were consuming. The Dutch in the 1700s followed the identical path. After a century of trade surpluses, the Dutch became net importers. Amsterdam's wealth made its people comfortable. Why labor in factories when you can live off accumulated capital? Dutch investment shifted from trade and production to finance. They became Europe's bankers, lending to other kingdoms instead of making goods. This generates profits, but it's passive income, not productive growth. The trade balance reversed. They imported more than they exported. They paid for it by liquidating accumulated wealth. Britain in the early 1900s faced the same reversal. By 1900, Britain was running trade deficits. They imported food, raw materials, and increasingly manufactured products. They paid for this with returns on overseas investments, centuries of accumulated wealth invested in railroads, mines, and businesses across the empire. The investment income was huge, but it was extracting wealth created elsewhere, not generating new wealth at home. British manufacturing declined. The investment income was huge, but it was extracting wealth created elsewhere, not generating new wealth at home. British manufacturing declined. Factories that had led the Industrial Revolution were shutting down or falling behind American and German rivals. The trade deficit expanded every year, living beyond their means, financed by liquidating the past. The United States entered Stage 4 in 1971, when the trade surplus permanently flipped into a deficit. By the 1980s, the deficit was growing fast. By the 2000s, the U.S. was running history's largest trade deficit, $800 billion yearly. The U.S. brings in far more than it ships out. Consumer products, electronics, cars, textiles, everything from overseas. How does this get financed? By shipping out dollars, printing currency, and swapping it for actual goods. This works only because the dollar holds reserve status. Other nations need dollars for reserves and trade, so they accept them. But this is living beyond means consuming more than you produce. And it's the identical pattern that came before every previous reserve currency's collapse. When deficits become unbearable, when you can't borrow enough to cover spending, you debase the currency. You print money. Portugal did this in the 1550s. Facing deficits and shrinking trade revenues, the Portuguese crown started debasing the real. They cut the silver content in coins, issued more currency than they had metal to support it. This triggered inflation. Prices climbed, merchants started refusing reals or demanding more of them for products. The currency's buying power eroded. By the 1570s, the real was losing credibility. International traders started preferring other currencies for business. The Dutch did this in the 1700s. The guilder had been supported by a solid banking system and careful monetary policy. But by the mid-1700s, the Dutch government was borrowing heavily to finance wars and maintain their colonial empire. When borrowing became too costly, they started inflating the currency, printing money to cover shortfalls. The guilder's value dropped by the 1780s. It was no longer the preferred currency for international trade. Britain debased the pound through 2 world wars. World War I forced Britain to print money and abandon the gold standard temporarily. They returned to gold in 1925, but at an inflated rate that caused economic suffering. World War II forced them off gold permanently. By 1945, the pound was floating and losing value. Britain printed money to rebuild and fund the welfare state. The pound devalued repeatedly in 1949 and 1967. Each devaluation destroyed international confidence. By the 1970s, the pound was no longer a reserve currency, it was a regional currency. The United States entered Stage 5 in 2008. The financial crisis forced the Federal Reserve to print money on an unprecedented scale. Quantitative easing $3.5 trillion created from 2008 to 2014. Then COVID struck, another $7 trillion printed from 2020 to 2022. The money supply expanded faster than any time in American history outside wartime. The money supply expanded faster than any time in American history outside wartime. This is currency debasement not by cutting metal content in coins, but by expanding the supply of paper currency, and the result is identical. The dollar's buying power declines, inflation surges. In 2021 and 2022, inflation hit levels not seen in 40 years. The difference between the U.S. and previous reserve currencies is scale. The dollar is global. When the Fed prints, it ships inflation to the entire planet. Other nations watch their dollar reserves lose value. Their dollar-denominated debt becomes cheaper to repay, but their imports from America become more expensive. This stage is where confidence starts cracking, and once confidence breaks, Stage 6 follows fast. This is when the world starts hunting for exits. When trust in the reserve currency crumbles and nations start shifting reserves to alternatives, Portugal lost confidence in the 1570s and 1580s. International traders started demanding payment in Spanish silver or Venetian ducats instead of Portuguese reals. Trade contracts started pricing in other currencies. Asian merchants who had accepted reals for decades started refusing them or demanding larger amounts to account for debasement. By 1580, when Spain absorbed Portugal, the real was already functionally dead as a reserve currency. The annexation just formalized what markets had already decided. The Dutch guilder lost confidence through the 1700s. The French, British, and other European powers started holding more reserves in other currencies. By the 1780s, Amsterdam was no longer Europe's financial center. London had seized that position. The guilder still got used in regional trade, but not for major international deals. The shift was gradual but unstoppable. The British pound lost confidence rapidly after World War II. In 1945, Britain owed massive war debts to the United States and other allies. The pound was overvalued and supported only by American loans. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound by 30%. International holders of pounds lost almost a third of their value overnight. Confidence collapsed. Nations started shifting reserves from pounds to dollars. By 1960, the pound's share of global reserves had dropped from over 60% in 1945 to less than 20%. The transition from pound to dollar was complete within 15 years. The U.S. dollar is in the early phases of Stage 6 right now. The signs are everywhere. China and Russia started cutting dollar reserves in the 2010s. They've been purchasing gold instead, thousands of tons. China's official gold reserves have more than doubled since 2008, but unofficially analysts believe they hold far more. Russia liquidated nearly all its U.S. Treasury holdings after 2014 sanctions. But unofficially, analysts believe they hold far more. Russia liquidated nearly all its U.S. Treasury holdings after 2014 sanctions. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have been discussing alternatives to the dollar for trade. In 2023, they announced plans for a BRICS currency. It hasn't launched yet, But the fact it's being discussed matters. Saudi Arabia, which has priced oil in dollars since 1974, the foundation of the petrodollar system, started accepting yuan for oil sales to China in 2023. This breaks a 50-year precedent. Central banks worldwide are diversifying reserves. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 72% in 2000 to 58% in 2024. That's a 14 percentage point drop. It sounds modest, but it represents trillions of dollars moved out of dollar assets. The euro, yuan, and gold have absorbed most of this. Even smaller nations are cutting dollar exposure. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. They're negotiating trade deals that settle in local currencies instead of dollars. This is the start of Stage 6, the world hunting for alternatives. Not because they despise America, but because they recognize the same pattern that destroyed every previous reserve currency: endless deficits, currency debasement, loss of buying power. They're not waiting for Stage 7, they're positioning now. This is when a new currency rises to replace the old, not through formal agreement, but through market adoption. The world simply quits using the old currency and starts using the new. The Portuguese real got replaced by the Spanish silver peso in the late 1500s. Spain had conquered vast silver mines in the Americas, Potosi in Bolivia, Zacatecas in Mexico. These mines produced more silver than the rest of the planet combined. Spanish silver coins became the preferred currency for international trade because they were plentiful, standardized, and backed by ongoing production. The real, debased and declining, couldn't compete. Merchants refused it. The transition happened over 2 decades. By 1600, the real was irrelevant. The Dutch guilder got replaced by the British pound in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Britain's Industrial Revolution and naval dominance made the pound the obvious successor. London's financial markets became deeper and more liquid than Amsterdam's. The pound was backed by British manufacturing and trade power. The transition took about 30 years. By 1815, after Napoleon's wars, the pound was the undisputed global standard. The guilder was a regional currency. The British pound got replaced by the US dollar from 1945 to 1960. The transition was formalized at Bretton Woods but took years to complete. Britain was bankrupt after World War II. The US held most of the world's gold and had the only intact industrial base. The dollar was the only currency that could serve as a global standard. The pound collapsed in a series of devaluations. By 1967, when the pound was devalued again, it was clear the dollar had fully replaced it. So, what replaces the dollar? That's the question everyone's asking, and the answer isn't obvious yet because we're not at Stage 7, we're in Stage 6. The search for alternatives, but history offers hints. The replacement currency comes from the nation with military dominance over trade routes, a trade surplus, and productive capacity. Right now, that's not any single country. China has the trade surplus in production, but it doesn't control global trade routes militarily. The yuan isn't freely convertible. China's capital controls prevent it from being a true reserve currency. You can't be the reserve currency if people can't freely move money in and out of your country. The euro is the second most held reserve currency, but Europe has deep structural problems: aging population, no unified fiscal policy, dependence on external energy. Germany has the production, but Southern Europe doesn't. It's a fragmented system. Gold is growing in appeal. Central banks are buying more gold than any time since the 1970s. Gold can't be printed, can't be debased, but it can't scale to handle trillions in daily transactions. There's not enough gold on Earth to back the volume of global trade. Some analysts think the replacement won't be a single currency but a basket. Some analysts think the replacement won't be a single currency but a basket. Maybe IMF, special drawing rights, a basket of currencies becomes the standard. Or maybe technology enables something new, a digital currency backed by a commodity or algorithm. The most likely scenario is a messy transition, a period of multipolar currency competition, several regional currencies used in different trade blocs, the dollar in the Americas, the euro in Europe, the yuan in Asia, gold for settlement between blocks. This wouldn't be clean, it would be volatile, unstable, and economically painful. But it's how transitions happen when there's no clear successor. If you found this breakdown valuable and want to stay ahead of what's coming in Stage 6, subscribe now. The pattern is clear. History doesn't lie, and those who recognize it early protect themselves while others lose everything. Don't be the liquidity.